Hello everyone and welcome back to another BOOKMAS video. Today I wanted to share some recommendations for books that I think are perfect to read during the winter season. We're already in the middle of December, Christmas is just in a few days, and then New Year's is next, and the festivities around the month of December will be over, which makes me very sad. But one way that I guess cope with the gloomy weather and the very long winters that we have here, at least in Southern Ontario, is to read, of course. And reading in the winter time is just on another level for me. I love cozying up with a book that feels wintry in the winter season. I don't know what it is about winter, but it's probably my favorite season for reading. I love it so much. And I've actually grown to really love the winter season. I love the snow, and I especially love books that feature snow, ice, cold weather, beautiful descriptions of the snowy landscape. And so I made a list of books like this, and part of the list features books I have not yet read. So what I'm gonna do is split this video in two. I will have this first part be the recommendations, so books I've already read that I would recommend for the winter season for January, February, March, or if you live in the Southern Hemisphere for the middle of the year. But the other half of the video will feature books that I want to read this winter. So they're all books that either have winter in the title or the cover screams winter, or I've heard from other people that they feel very wintry and cold, and I love that so much. So I will have the second part of this video coming out in a couple days. So this is just the books that I have read that I would recommend. But without further ado, let's dive right in and grab yourselves a warm beverage. I have hot chocolate in this hot cocoa mug, and we're just gonna get cozy and talk about all the wintry books. I have organized all these books by genre as well, and we'll start off with historical fiction and then move through classics, fantasy, and mysteries. This first book here is not actually set during winter, but there's just something about it that feels perfect for the winter season. And I'm talking about Born of Gilded Mountains by Amanda Dykes. Amanda Dykes is one of my favorite Christian fiction authors, and this one is currently my favorite of her works. It is her newest release as well. I adored this book so much. As you can tell, I went nuts with the tabbing, but it was just beautiful. I'm not going to spend too much time on each book or we'll be here for a very long time, but this book really deals with friendship. That is at the center of the story. Friendship between two women, Mercy and Rusty, and it's set in the Colorado mountains. There is a missing train car. There is a riddle that needs to be solved. It's set in the 40s, and it has letters between the characters as well, so there's just different formats within the story. And it is beautiful, beautifully written, and because it's set in Colorado in the mountains, I just feel like it's a perfect winter read. It's on the slower side in terms of its pacing, and it's just one of those perfect novels to cozy up with on a cold winter evening. I think it's perfection, and I think anyone who loves historical fiction would really enjoy this book. I adore it so much, so this is the first recommendation. I would also recommend Marmee by Sarah Miller. This is kind of like a retelling of Little Women, not really a retelling. It's Marmee's perspective of all the events that occur in Little Women and Good Wives. And this is all told through Marmee's journal entries as well. So this would work really well for Epistolary January if you plan on participating. If you haven't heard of that readathon, I'll have the announcement video linked below. But this one, even though it's not all set throughout winter, just like Little Women, it's set over many, many years. There's just something about the coziness that Little Women is that is perfect for the winter season. And this book is absolute perfection. I adored it so much. We get a lot more of the Civil War in this story than we do in Little Women, as Marmee is of course very stressed about her husband being an army chaplain in the war. And there are some bleak moments described in here as well, and it's just a very heartfelt story and another great winter read. Another historical fiction I would recommend for winter is Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. This one is such a harrowing story. It's about a Lithuanian family who are arrested by the Soviet police. It is set during the Second World War, and so this Lithuanian family, they are sent to a prison camp in Siberia. It is such a harrowing story, and our main character Lena, she is an aspiring artist, and it's just such a beautiful story of hope and resilience in such a dark time in history. And with it being set in Siberia as well, there are many, many moments where you feel the cold, and it's definitely a great one to read if you love historical fiction for the winter months. This next book, I actually just finished it a few days ago and was absolutely blown away. I am so glad I read this. I'm talking about The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This is my first book by this author, and it will not be my last. I adored this. It's another one where I could not stop tabbing. It was just incredible. This one is about a real midwife who lived in Maine in the 1700s. Her name was Martha Ballard, and she was such an incredible woman. And even though I put this in the historical fiction section, this is technically also a thriller. The book is definitely inspired by Martha's life, but a lot of the events of the story are fictional. But either way, it starts off with a dead body being found in the Kennebec River in Maine, and there's also a court case happening because this woman has accused two men of raping her, and it is a very difficult read. It deals with some very, very difficult topics, but it is set throughout the winter. It is very, very wintry. The story opens on a very cold November day, and this is what it says. The body floats downstream, but it is late November, and the Kennebec River is starting to freeze. Large chunks of ice swirling and tumbling through the water, collecting in mounds, while clear, cold fingers of ice stretch out from either bank, reaching into the current, grabbing hold of all that passes by. Already weighed down by soaked clothing and heavy leather boots, the dead man bobs in the ebbing current, unseeing eyes staring at the waning crescent moon. It is a miserable night with bitter wind and numbing frost, and the slower the river moves, the quicker it freezes, trapping him in its sluggish grip as folds of his homespun linen shirt are thrown out like petals of wilted brown tulip. There are a couple other lines here that just show how wintry this book is. Here it says, the storm barrels in from the east, across the Atlantic, a monster building out in the ocean and pushing all that wind and snow across the coast and inland. Building, building until it is a wall of white that swallows everything in its path. And then the start of another chapter. I'm awakened by a hand on my shoulder, shaking, gently, a whisper, warm breath on my ear. I hadn't slept well, too aware of the wind seeping through the chinks in the walls, of the plummeting cold, and the snow that was falling, not like a blanket, but like a burial shroud. This book is just incredible. It is very slow paced. It's a slow burn of a thriller, but so well written. And even though I don't really like present tense, this is in present tense and it works perfectly for this type of story. It's such a perfect read for the winter time, but I would look more into the trigger warnings. Of course, it deals with a rape trial and childbirth, and it can be pretty gruesome at times, but it's such an incredible story. I love that it's inspired by true events, and it's so wintry and eerie, and I love it. We're gonna move on to classics now, and this first classic I recommend it solely because of the subject matter and the fact that it is not a lighthearted story at all. And I find I gravitate towards classics like this in the winter time, and it's intense. I'm talking about Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. It has been a few years since I've read this, and I really want to reread it. This book, it is not an easy read. I am not the type of reader that enjoys reading about adultery, and it's a huge theme in this book. But the way that Leo Tolstoy explores that theme is just profound and so impactful, and this book is intense. And I adore Levin, and I love Kitty, and even though Anna and Vronsky drove me nuts, I still sympathized with them, and this book was just insane. Maybe because it's also set in Russia, I always associate Russia with winter, but I just think it's a great winter classic. If you've never read Anna Karenina, highly recommend it. This is the Pavir and Volokonsky translation, and I really enjoyed the translation. It's the only one I've read, so it's a book I would definitely recommend. This next book is a modern classic, and I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. I kind of hesitate to recommend it just because of its subject matter as well. But The Secret History by Donna Tartt is another great winter read as well. There are some really beautiful passages in the wintertime. A lot of people recommend this around the fall season, and for sure it's a great fall read as well. It's very dark academia. It has to do with a university, and it has all those academic vibes, so definitely the fall time as well. But there's just something about how dark this story is that I feel fits the winter season as well. This story is insane. It has to do with a murder of a college student on campus. We know who the victim is, we know what happens, but then we're seeing the aftermath, and it's just a very heavy read. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone, like I was saying. I would definitely look up the trigger warnings for this book because there are a lot, but I just found the writing to be absolute perfection, and I was so swept away in the story. I could not put it down while I was reading it. It almost felt like a fever dream. And I remember when I did read it, I was actually sick. I had a fever, so I don't know. I honestly loved it while I read it. I loved the reading experience, even though I hated every single character. I thought this book was incredible. I also wanted to recommend my current favorite book by Daphne du Maurier, and that is Jamaica Inn. This one is set on the Cornish moors. We have a woman named Mary who moves in with her aunt and uncle, and she starts to notice some really weird things happening. It deals with smuggling and murder. Mary's uncle is a very overbearing and awful human, and it just has a dark atmosphere to it as well. And I think it's a great winter thriller. It's a great classic to read in the winter months, and I do really want to reread it as well as Rebecca, but that is Jamaica Inn. Next up is The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This, I think, is book 6 in the Little House on the Prairie series. I feel like because so many people are familiar with the Little House, either the Little House show or the books, a lot of people have heard of the family, the Ingalls family at least. So even though I would recommend reading the books in order, I do think it's still fun to, you know, pick up a book and see if you like it and then start the series again. And I would definitely recommend reading The Long Winter during the winter time. This one is set, of course, during a very long winter, as the title suggests. I believe 6 months out of the year, the town that the Ingalls family are living in is hit with this huge snowstorm, and they can't get any food, any coal, because the trains can't get into the town. And it's a very, very difficult winter season for the family. And there are some beautiful passages as well, just depicting the weather. Laura put Ma's big shawl over her head and pinned it snugly under her chin with the shawl pin. The woolen folds covered her from head to foot. Even her hands were under the shawl, only her face was out. Outdoors, the sun glitter hurt her eyes. I love that, sun glitter. She breathed a deep breath of the tingling cold and squinted her eyes to look around her. The sky was hugely blue and all the land was blowing white. The straight, strong wind did not lift the snow, but drove it scudding across the prairie. The cold stung Laura's cheeks. It burned in her nose and tingled in her chest and came out in steam on the air. She held a fold of the shawl across her mouth, and her breath made frost on it. It's just such a wholesome story of how the Ingalls family survived this very, very cold and bleak winter, and I love it so, so much. Highly recommend. I would also recommend Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This one's often recommended in autumn reading lists as well, for good reason. But I often forget that a lot of this book takes place in very cold settings. We have descriptions of ice and the Arctic, and even the first chapter, as the story opens, has descriptions of the cold weather. I'm already far north of London, and as I walk in the streets of Petersburg, I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. Do you understand this feeling? This breeze which has traveled from the regions towards which I'm advancing gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. And from the 4th chapter, or 4th letter, last Monday, we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving her the sea room in which she floated. About 2 o'clock, the mist cleared away, and we beheld, stretched out in every direction, vast and irregular plains of ice, which seemed to have no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts. So we get a lot of descriptions of snow and ice and frost and icebergs in the Arctic, and it's definitely a great winter classic as well. Frankenstein is iconic for good reason. Out of all of Elizabeth Gaskell's works, I believe that Sylvia's Lovers is best to read during the winter months. It is set during many different months of the year, but there's just something about it. It's set in this northern English town that is based on, I believe, Whitby. It's set against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars at the end of the 18th century, and our main character, Sylvia, she is kind of in this love triangle, and some crazy things happen in this story. It is slow-paced for the first half, but the second half really picks up and it deals with some difficult topics. There's a little bit of a dark feel. It's very atmospheric, and there were moments while I was reading where I felt cold, and I just think it's a great winter read. I love this book so much. I love Elizabeth Gaskell so much, and I think this is a great one for the winter months. Also by Elizabeth Gaskell, I would recommend The Old Nurse's Story, and this is a very wintry ghost story, and I don't want to say too much about it just because it is a short story, so going into it not knowing really anything about it is the best way to go about reading this story. It's spooky and atmospheric, and there are descriptions of the snow falling around this manor. Even though it's not an all-time favorite story, I'm not really huge on short stories. I think it's a great winter read. And the last classic, which is a great segue into fantasy as well, I would definitely recommend C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. I haven't read all of the Chronicles of Narnia. I still have the last 2 or 3 in the series to read. But of course, I would recommend The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is one of the best stories ever written, in my opinion, and it's very wintry. There's just something about fantasy that fits winter for me so much. I definitely gravitate towards fantasy in the winter, and stories like these are perfect for the winter season as well. There's really nothing else I could say about the Chronicles of Narnia other than wintertime is the perfect time to read them. So I have some more fantasy books to recommend. I also have 2 books here by the same author, and I'm talking about the Enchanted Sonata and Entwined by Heather Dixon Wallwork. They're both retellings of very well-known stories. The Enchanted Sonata is a retelling of the Nutcracker, and Entwined is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. Both stories open around the Christmas season. This one you can't really tell by the cover, but they both do open around the Christmas season and then follow the days afterwards. And I don't think you should know too much else going in other than this one is a retelling of the Nutcracker, like I was saying, with a dash of the Pied Piper. And even though these start off on Christmas, I don't think you need to read them just around the Christmas season. I think they're great to read anytime in the winter. This one is my favorite of the two, but I would definitely recommend both for the winter. They're both so whimsical and just beautifully written and full of magic. And I love this author's writing and wish that she would write more, but would definitely recommend these. Another retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses is Wildwood Dancing, and this is by Juliet Mariller. It's been so long since I've read this book, and there's a lot I don't remember about it, so I'm just gonna go off of Goodreads. It says, high in the Transylvanian woods live 5 daughters and their doting father. It's an idyllic life for Jenna, the second eldest, who spends her time exploring the mysterious forest with her constant companion, a most unusual frog. But best by far is the castle's hidden portal, known only to the sisters. Every full moon, they alone can pass through it into the enchanted world of the other kingdom. There, they dance through the night with the fey creatures of this magical realm. But their peace is shattered when father falls ill and must go to the southern parts to recover, for that is when cousin Caesar arrives. Though he's there to help the girls survive the brutal winter, Jenna suspects he has darker motives in store. Meanwhile, Jenna's sister has fallen in love with a dangerous creature of the other kingdom. An impossible union it's up to Jenna to stop. When Caesar's grip of power begins to tighten, at stake is everything Jenna loves, her home, her family, and the other kingdom she has come to cherish. To save her world, Jenna will be tested in ways she can't imagine. Tests of trust, strength, and true love. I, of course, love that it's set in Romania. I love that I understood a lot of the cultural references and the food and everything and the setting. And I believe it's also technically set in the medieval period as well. But I do remember it being extremely wintry and so atmospheric and just perfect for winter as well. It's so whimsical and I remember loving it, and I really need to reread it soon, but that is Wildwood Dancing. Another fairy tale retelling I always recommend around the winter season is Hunted by Megan Spooner. This one is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast and is perfection. I think this is one of the best retellings I've ever read, and it is so wintry. In this one, our main character, her father goes missing in the woods, and I believe it's set in a fictional world that feels kind of inspired by Russia and just the Slavic countries in the wintertime. And our main character, her father goes missing in the woods, and she goes to look for him and then ends up stumbling across this castle. And it is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, so it's kind of predictable in that sense, but still such a fun twist on the fairy tale. And it is perfection for winter. Highly recommend. Another book I would recommend for winter is Wishtress by Nadine Brandes. I wouldn't say that Nadine Brandes is like a favorite author. I haven't absolutely adored her books, but I did very much enjoy this one, and I think it's great for both fall and winter. And even the cover, you can kind of tell by the cover that it's set around those two seasons. But I will also read the inside for this one as my memory is terrible. But it says, she didn't ask to be Wishtress. Mirth was born with the ability to turn her tears into wishes, but when a granted wish goes wrong, she's cursed. The next tear she sheds will kill her. She must travel to the well to break the curse before it can claim her life, and before the king's militarin find her. To survive the journey, Mirth must harden her heart to keep herself from crying even a single tear. He can stop time with a snap of his fingers. Bastian's powerful and rare talent came in handy when he kidnapped the old king. Now the new king has a job for him, find the Wishtress and deliver her to the Schloss. But Bastian needs a wish of his own. He gains Mirth's trust by promising to take her to the well, but once he gets what he needs, he'll turn her in. As long as his growing feelings for the girl with a stone heart don't compromise him. Their quest can end only one way, with her death. Everyone seems to need a wish. The king, Mirth's cousin, the boy she thinks she loves. And they're ready to bully, beg, and betray her for it. No one knows that to grant even one wish, Mirth must pay with her life. And if she tells them about the curse, they'll just kill her anyway. I just think these types of fantasy stories are perfect for winter. It's a really great one. Would definitely recommend. And the last fantasy novel that I would recommend is Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. I love the Caraval trilogy so much, and I would also recommend those. I probably should have grabbed them off my shelves. But there's just something about the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy that screams winter to me, especially the second book. And I mean, it's set in a place called the Magnificent North. Like, it's perfect for winter. I will say though, this was only like a 3.5 star read for me, but it's mainly because YA fantasy I'm not the biggest fan of, and it takes a really good YA fantasy book for me to give it 5 stars. I'm very picky, but even so, I just have such a special place in my heart for Stephanie Garber and her works. And I think this book and this trilogy is perfect for winter. It is just whimsy and magic and old-fashioned fairy tale vibes. I just love it for that. And it's kind of silly and kind of over the top, but perfect for when I'm in the mood for these types of books. And if you are in the mood for this type of book, winter is the perfect time to read it. So would highly recommend. I do think for the overall reading experience, it may be better to read the Caraval series first, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think you can read the series first and then go back to Caraval. But either way, I had such a great time reading this series, and the second book in particular is extremely wintry. So if you want to read this one first and then the second book, that is perfect. But that is the last fantasy that I wanted to recommend. And then I also wanted to recommend some mystery thriller type of books. I did talk about The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon in the historical fiction section, but it's definitely a thriller as well. So just wanted to bring that one up again. But these next two books are both by Agatha Christie, and she hasn't written very many books where the season is prominent in the story, where like you feel the weather and the weather is described in a very atmospheric way. Some of her books are summery for sure, like some of them are set in Egypt, some are set in the Mediterranean, so they have that summery feel. But for the most part, her books aren't very seasonal. But these two here are set during winter time. The first one here is The Murder at Hazelmoor, and this one is otherwise known as the Sittaford Mystery. I will also say with this one, if things to do with like seances bother you, this one may bother you. Agatha Christie has mentioned and featured seances in quite a few of her books actually. The way that she does it doesn't bother me because it's always shown as something very silly and not real. But if that's something that bothers you, just wanted to mention that. But like I was saying, this one does open up on a cold, cold winter night and a seance occurs, which again is shown as very, very silly. But at this table, there is an announcement made that someone will die, and then that person is found dead many hours later. And Poirot is on the case trying to figure out what happened. So it's a great winter one. And the other obvious one is Murder on the Orient Express. If you've never read this book, this is the perfect time of year to read it. And I love books set on trains. I want to read more set on trains. I think they're so fun, especially mysteries. And I really like how this one is a train wreck. And then we have kind of that isolated close circle of suspects after someone is found murdered, and Poirot is on the case as well. So another great winter mystery. I would also recommend The Snow Child by Ewan Ivey. Now I didn't absolutely adore this book, but I do think it's a great winter read as well. It's set in Alaska in, I believe, the 1920s. I did put it in the mystery section, although it could have also gone in the historical fiction, but it's kind of a magical realism mystery type of story. But this book is basically about an older couple who moved to Alaska. They haven't been able to have children, so they make this big move to Alaska. And of course, it's a pretty brutal place to live, especially in the 1920s. And for people who didn't grow up in that kind of environment, it's a very hard place to live and to homestead. And they struggle with loneliness and this feeling of despair. It's a very isolating kind of environment to live in. And they're also struggling with their mental health because they haven't been able to have children, and that was something that they really wanted. And one day, this couple makes a snow child, and the next day the snow child is gone, but this mysterious blonde girl is on their property. There's just something off about her, and the story goes from there. It is magical realism, like I was saying, and there's a bit of that mystery of who this person is, and the writing just makes the story feel so cold and bleak, and it's so atmospheric and a perfect winter read. I would also recommend Royal Blood by Rhys Bowen. This is the fourth book in the Royal Spinous series. I would say it's fun to read them in order, but it's not absolutely necessary. And our main character, Georgie, she is 34th in line to the British throne. It's set in the 1930s. And she, in each book, is kind of given this task by Queen Mary. And in this one, she's asked by the Queen to represent the royal family at this wedding that's happening in Transylvania. And so Georgie goes to Transylvania. It's very cold and wintry and snowy, and there's little hints of a possible vampire, and it's just so silly. It is so fun, and this one is a perfect wintry read as well. They're staying in a castle in Transylvania as well, so it's kind of like a medieval castle, and it's just so fun. And with the setting being a castle in Transylvania, I already mentioned there are some hints at a possible vampire, and it's so over the top and silly and unbelievable, but every minute spent with Lady Georgie is so much fun, and I just think this is a great one for winter as well. And the last book on this list of recommendations is These Silent Woods by Kimmy Cunningham Grant, and this one is such a wonderful, wonderful book. It is a thriller, and one of the few thrillers that I actually adored. It's more of a survival thriller, but it's very slow burn, and it's not like a fast-paced story by any means. but it is just so powerful and packs such an emotional punch. Our main characters are Cooper and his young daughter, and they live in isolation in the Appalachian woods, and they have no electricity. They only get supplies brought to them once a year by one person that Cooper trusts. But one year, this man doesn't show up with all the supplies, and Cooper has no way really of getting a hold of him unless he were to go into town, which he does not want to do. And a chain of events unfolds as a result. A mysterious person also shows up in the woods and further complicates Cooper's desire to remain hidden and isolated. And it's just such an insane story, and I loved it so much. Would highly recommend. It is so atmospheric, so wintry, and it's perfect for the winter season as well. But friends, those are all the books I wanted to recommend for the winter season. I'm sure there were other books that I could have recommended that I just didn't think of adding to this list. But I'm also really excited to share my list of books that I want to read this winter, and even though I haven't read them, they may also be some recommendations for you as well. Some of them may sound interesting to you, so that video will come out a couple days after this one. But that's it for this video, friends. If you've read any of these books, I would love to know what your thoughts were, and if you have any recommendations for me for wintry reads, please do let me know in the comments below. But thank you, friends, so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next Bookmas video. Bye!